Buonasera a tutti, good evening everybody. Mi rincresce che dobbiamo parlare in inglese, continuiamo in inglese, a parte qualche citazione. So we're going to continue in English. Welcome everybody. This evening, the Italian Academy is proud to have Jhumpa Lahiri, and alas, I have to take out the name of Alessandro Giammei because he is stuck in a plane. He has been stuck in a plane in Oregon and has not made it here this evening. I'll return to the subject in a moment. At any rate, so we're proud to have Jhumpa still with us this evening. And they were going to talk, and Jhumpa will still talk, about Italo Calvino on the occasion of the centenary of his birth, which, as some of you may know, was on the 19th of September 1923. Most of you probably know that Calvino was born in Havana, and when we consider how after his family returned to the family house and farm in San Remo, he dithered between Turin, Paris, and New York. When one thinks of this, one immediately thinks also of those magical cities. I'm not going to talk about Calvino, don't worry. This is just the introduction to Jhumpa. But I still couldn't resist saying, when one thinks of those magical cities in the wonderful Le Città Invisibili, in which Marco Polo, of all people, tells Kublai Khan, of all other people, of the 12 extraordinary cities that still keep us spellbound. What better emblems for the kinds of transcultural, intellectual, and cultural exchange which the Italian Academy has fostered from the very beginnings of its fellowship program in the first year of this century. This has been our mission from the start, and I continue to dream of the ways in which that mission may achieve the ecumenical and irenic ideals, irenic, not ironic, irenic ideals which I believe underlie the humanities and which every day seem more distant. These days, perhaps more than ever, at least in our lifetimes. But if anyone could achieve something of that spirit of civil communication across borders and barriers, it's Jhumpa. Her writings cross culture with both instructiveness and ease. We're proud and happy that on top of her heavy duties as Millicent McIntosh Professor of English and Creative Writing at Barnard, she not only agreed to join our permanent group of senior fellows here at the Academy, but also to join our regular group of visiting fellows this year. She's been an essential member of our Wednesday seminars, and we've all admired her calm and precise interventions, strong but always tactful, and full of the wisdom that she reveals in her books. Since it's not up to me to talk about Calvino today, let me just say a few brief things about Jhumpa. I was going to talk about Alessandro, but unfortunately I'll say one thing about him in a moment. It's astonishing to realize how much Jhumpa has written since she won the Pulitzer Prize for her first book, The Interpreter of Maladies of 2000. If I'd written even one book as beautifully as that wonderful edition, I would have been terrified even to try writing another. But this one was followed by a host of essays, stories, and then there was The Namesake, her first novel of 2003, the stories in Unaccustomed Earth of 2008, and then her once again immensely popular Lowland of 2013. The year after this, she was rightly awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama. I'm not going to go into all the other things on her CV, but then came the turning point, and Jhumpa started writing in Italian, and in 2015 she moved to Rome. So here I was going to give you the background on Alessandro, and I was going to conclude the background on Alessandro by saying his energy, if you went through his long list of books, is to give you the background of the questions which Jhumpa will tell you he raised about her views on Calvino. His energy, it's clear from his CV, is as grand as Jhumpa's. And if you look at Calvino's smile on the poster for today's event, rather wonderful poster of Calvino on a bicycle, he really would have been the right person for today's job. So this brings me back to Jhumpa. Let me briefly expand on the one aspect of her work which I find compelling, especially compelling, and certainly one of the greatest relevance to the mission of the Academy to figure out ways of communication between ourselves and the other, between our ways of knowing and theirs, between one discipline's epistemology and another's, between humanism and science, all as a way of reaching a deeper understanding of how we negotiate the differences between ourselves and others. It's precisely in this negotiation and the tensions it generates that we may begin to understand what it means to be human. The central project of Jhumpa's life now, I think, you can correct me, is that of translation. She has just produced that wonderful volume of tales, her Racconti romani, Roman stories. And this was preceded, so I'm not going to go through all of that, I just want to focus on one book in particular. This was preceded by the marvelous 2022 volume entitled Translating Myself and Others, and before that, her 2015 In Altre Parole. In other words, one of the most moving books I have read in many, many years. No one I know has written more honestly about both the difficulties and the importance of the act of translation. No one has written more frankly about themselves as translators, of what it means to take on the language of another and reject one's own. Of course, this question is even more complicated in Jhumpa's case, as most of you probably know, by the fact that she was born in England, brought up mostly in the US, speaking English to most people outside her family, and Bengali to her own mother, and with her own mother. So right at the outset, we confront the question of mother tongue or not mother tongue. And from this follows the question she herself poses, that of what is she rejecting? What is she rejecting? English herself. These are the questions that she so honestly poses in this marvelous book. It may seem so, given all the evidence that she is rejecting English itself, she herself provides, apart from one thing, the incomparable quality of her use of precisely that language, English. But of course it remains always the language of the other, something alienated and often inescapably the matter of alienation. It's significant that one of the things to which Jhumpa repeatedly returns is precisely the meaning of hybrid states, of the positive dimensions of hybridity, not just what it changes organically, but simultaneously of what it yields in terms of fructification. One of the other of her grand themes in this whole translation project, and that emerges in that first book about translation of 2015, In Altre Parole, the other theme that emerges there is that of metamorphosis. Is it any wonder that Jhumpa's current project, the one she's doing here at the Academy, is a translation of its great collection of mythopoeic tales of metamorphosis? We could spend the rest of this evening discuss just how one of those ancient fables, just as we had the privilege of doing with Jhumpa herself just a few weeks ago in our Wednesday seminar. So too for the question of acceptance and non-acceptance, which all this work raises, as when she sort of wittily and honestly raises, describing how her husband goes into a shop and her husband knows Italian very much less well than she does, or so she reports herself, goes into the shop and he's immediately complimented, but not her, after all these struggles with Italian and the perfect Italian that has resulted. Well, I leave you to draw your own conclusions on this matter. The candor, however, in the way she recounts the story is astonishing. The research, relentless and honest, even when it doesn't work. Towards the end of this fabulous book, Jhumpa admits that she always needs a support, like the scaffolding that had always been around the Portico d'Ottavia in the ghetto in Rome. There she liked the scaffolding that for so long supported, we all know, those of us who walk down the Via del Portico d'Ottavia in Rome have always seen scaffolding supporting the Portico d'Ottavia. It's so long supported the falling bits of the building, but for the most part, in her own words, she maintains, she confesses that una impalcatura non è una bella cosa. A scaffolding is not really a nice thing. Costituisce di solito una specie di opprobrio. something we dislike, interferisce, imbrutisce, it interferes with one's passage, it's ugly. Idealmente non dovrebbe esserci, ideally it shouldn't be there. I hope you're thinking of what's outside there. Se mi capita di dover passare sotto un'impalcatura, preferisco, conosciamo gente così, I'm inserting here, preferisco attraversare la strada. When you see a scaffolding, she prefers, when I see a scaffolding, I prefer to cross the road. Temo sempre che stia per stramazzare. I'm always afraid it'll just collapse in a big puff. Now that the Italian Academy is itself covered in impalcature, in scaffolding, thank you, Jhumpa, for risking coming under that scaffolding to the Italian Academy. We are certainly not the Portico d'Ottavia, dobbiamo ammetterlo. Thank you for joining us in that other effort you described so well. There's another effort, and I'm going to conclude these introductory remarks with this, that of sounding the other, sondare in Italian. There's a wonderful passage here in the same book about it. Its basic meaning, as you, some of you, most of you perhaps, is to explore, to examine, just as befits the work we do in the university. It implies, of course, not only detachment, but a state of immersion and uncertainty. It means, she writes, methodical, stubborn research into something that remains forever out of reach, resta sempre fuori portata. But as Jhumpa also notes, at the same time, sondare also implies self-investigation, investigation into the self. And according to a dictionary, it also means, as we know, to seek to know, to understand something. To seek to know, to seek to understand something, in particular the thoughts and intentions of others. Un verbo azzeccato, she says, che spiega alla perfezione questo mio progetto. A well-aimed verb that perfectly explains my project. Who could have put it better? Thank you, Jhumpa, for being here with us at Barnard, Columbia, and the Italian Academy.
Thank you, David. Grazie di cuore. Thank you for such a thoughtful introduction to me. We're not here to, anyway, we're here to talk about Calvino. And, okay, how to begin? Calvino pushed everything to the extreme. And today we're going to push the idea of a dialogue that I was supposed to have with my dear friend and colleague Alessandro Giammei to the extreme in that I will be in dialogue with myself. But not exactly, because Alessandro prepared the questions in the airplane, when he realized that he was not going to make it in time to join us. Alessandro has been my impalcatura for many years, ever since I met him, and he's a scaffolding that I am so grateful for. I've learned most of what I have come to know about Italian literature thanks to my conversations with Alessandro, and today was supposed to be in the spirit of Calvino and his first memo for the new millennium. It was supposed to be something, a conversation that was molto leggera, very lighthearted, end of the semester, just the two of us talking, chatting about Calvino, something we've done so many times. And now we have a challenge. But I'm going to share something I wrote about Calvino, just a sentence to set the tone in this essay, short essay I wrote on Calvino. I say, I believe that Calvino was always in dialogue with himself, with his shadow twin, so as to see himself, as I have said, from a new perspective. So I'm going to be, as I said, in dialogue with my shadow twin, who is not sitting in the other yellow chair that was taken away. But let's just try to enjoy this absurd situation. And Anyway, these questions, they do come from Alessandro, who exemplifies, I have to say, exemplifies many of the notes of Calvino, certainly lightness and quickness and exactitude. Alas, his flight did not get here quickly enough. Anyway, I'm going to read his first question. I will answer it. And then what I thought I would do, he prepared 4 questions and sort of a chaser question, because we had a little surprise in store for you, this chaser question. But what I thought I would do is after he asks me the question and I answer him, I'll open it up to you so that if anybody has a comment or a question or reflection on that particular question, that subject, we can talk about it, okay? And then we could just break it up that way, because otherwise, well, let's just try that. So anyway, I'll start. Carissima Jhumpa, I'm writing to you from an airplane journey that keeps on being delayed, rerouted, rebooked, and delayed again since yesterday night. I have no hope to get to New York in time for our conversation on Calvino anymore. How frustrating. And yet, how fitting. Calvino claimed to be a devotee of the straight line, of immediate connections, of direct paths that allow for quickness, one of his keywords for this millennium. But we know that his teacher of quickness was actually the master of diversions, delays, and unexpected flights, Ludovico Ariosto, the inventor of the hippogriff. I believe that Calvino was a closeted devotee of forking, spiraling, bent, and queer paths, perhaps even especially when he pretended to want to get straight to the point. In the spirit of lightness, of the agility that Calvino praised through the Ovidian myth that inspired the best hippogriff scenes in Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, I'm going to ask you, in this memo sent from the skies, what I had planned to ask you in person. And I would like to start from the magical beast that I just mentioned, the hippogriff, along with his more classical cousins, Pegasus and the centaur. One beautiful thing you did in your recent book, Translating Myself and Others, was to remind us how Calvino is not just Italo, Italophone, Italiano, but that he is an amphibious hybrid, in quotes, mezzo e mezzo author. Would you talk a little bit about the metamorphic protean aspects of Calvino's legacy? So he started off nicely because he knows I wrote about this, and I'll share what I wrote. So I wrote an essay, the essay I cited from, in which I say Calvino, toward the end, that Calvino was always in dialogue with himself. It was really about why Calvino gained such popularity in the Anglosphere. And what I say is that he was so inherently translatable because he doesn't really, I claim, he doesn't write fully in Italian. And this may sound like a strange thing to say in the Italian Academy when we're all here to celebrate the centenary of Calvino, but I'll explain what I mean. Calvino was essentially a translator, and he was always, his central theme, if I can distill it, is that of communication, of dialogue, and the distance implicit in any dialogue. And we know his fascination with the tradition of dialogue, Platonic dialogue, the dialogues of Leopardi. So in this essay, I begin by sort of talking about his life and how much of a centaur hybrid he is just in his biographical details. The fact that he is born in Cuba, that he's raised in Italy, then he spends his life, so much of his most productive years, most, shall we say, stylistically, by now iconic years in Paris, where he says at one point he writes in another essay, I write in a language that exists only in my head and nowhere around me. And it's that ongoing dialogue with otherness and with the foreign that I think conditions Calvino from the very beginning. He wrote an incredible essay, introduction. I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke here in this beautiful theater on Ovid, an essay called Gli indistinti confini, so the blurry, indistinct confines or borders. And this is his place. This is the place of Calvino to understand and experiment constantly with the state of instability. And this is very important, I think, to understand about Calvino, because I think he has a reputation of as being a writer who is so precise and so controlled, which he is, but it's a precision and a control that is in ongoing dialogue with sort of the state of entropy, forces of chaos, disorder, and I would argue instability. So he's yoking these two forces together, okay? I think in his general vision. He's yoking together genre throughout his, extraordinary trajectory, creative trajectory, from, folklore and mythology to neorealism, epic, philosophy, the language of science. And even more specifically, he is creating and insisting upon dialogue between the rational and what I would call the mythical or the magical, the mythical, magical, monstrous, that whole category of things that are unreal, that cannot be proven, that cannot be explained scientifically. And Calvino himself, talks about it in terms of, when he talks about his project for Invisible Cities, he talks about the dialogue between pure geometry and the tangle, he calls it the tangle of human lives. So this is a starting point for understanding, I think, the dialogic energy and essence of Italo Calvino. And it's a dialogue that he replays in his work as literal dialogue between characters, between people. He's so interested in the question of language. I mean, he's so fundamentally, I think, obsessed with the question of language and what language means to be a human being. Which is why, of course, he's curious about the animal kingdom and how animals communicate. And these are humanistic questions, but also, as we know, scientific questions. So, Alessandro, this is how I would respond to how Calvino is embodying the energy, the spirit, the attitude of a centaur-like creature, someone who is composed of two very different parts that are creating a unique whole. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on this particular aspect of Calvino? In fact, I could even read a little bit for you. Yeah, I'll read a little bit from this essay because it will take less time than if I try to paraphrase myself. So I talk about how he always has his sort of attention focused on the foreign and foreign authors. He writes his thesis on Conrad, who interestingly wrote, would be called an exophonic writer writing outside of his language. But this is what I say. And here I'm talking about Calvino translated into English. and the great William Weaver, who translated so much of Calvino so beautifully. William Weaver, Calvino's American translator, says in an interview with the Paris Review that Calvino was easy to translate because he wrote in a literary language, a universal idiom that lends itself naturally to translation. He adds, however, that it was also a challenge to replicate the careful rhythm of his prose, and that he would read passages of Invisible Cities out loud while he translated. Weaver also understands Calvino's passion for scientific language and for technical terms, which pose another hurdle for any translator, introducing yet another language, one that is rigorously specific to his writing. This is my point. Calvino, a distinctly Italian writer, has never written purely in Italian. On the contrary, he had his own language, an expressive kingdom belonging only to him, as do all other important and interesting writers. So I think I'm talking about the sort of macaronic aspect of Calvino, and that he is drawing on the language of philosophy, the language of science, and not always, and a lot of this language that he's incorporating into his work was not originally Italian. It is coming through translation. And that's what I'm talking about, his language is itself a hybrid entity, more so than many other writers, or more so than, let's say, the average writer.
I can't help but think of the Castle of Crossed Destinies, and where tarot cards were the language, and I wondered if you could comment on that in your beautiful description of language in his work.
Absolutely. In fact, this is the special fifth question surprise we were going to talk a little bit about that text. But I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but you probably can't see because we decided to do this without slides. But this is a hybrid text of language, sort of, words, the language of words, and of images. And I don't know if anybody, but if you can't see, in the margins of this text, there are reproductions, illustrations of tarot cards. And so again, you have the fact of dialogue. You have dialogue between text and image, which is very unusual. I mean, now we see more, well, before books were illustrated, and then less so, and now there are authors who like to incorporate photographs, for example, and it's become more common to see. There's the graphic novel. There's all sorts of new but old ways of presenting a text and defining a text, creating a text. But Calvino was doing this, and it's extraordinary. And I think it's another example, I agree with you, of how he is creating this, insisting on what I call hybrid language, which is by definition not purely one thing or the other. And I would insist still that it is not purely Italian in that sense. Shall we move on to the next question? Yes? Okay. All right. Every time I say that I work on Ariosto's afterlives in the 20th century, someone answers, "Oh, so you work on Calvino." I wish I was there to tell you why I actually did not write about Calvino at all in my book about Ariosto and modernity. Alessandro's written an amazing book that will soon be available to us all on Ariosto, and he does not talk about Calvino in that book. But maybe, since we are talking about influence and magical beasts, you could tell me instead whether you would write about Calvino in a book about Ovid and modernity. I am thinking of one special talent in Calvino's toolkit here, Mythopoeia, his ability to establish or reforge myths, as he did in Le Città Invisibili or in Il Cavaliere Inesistente. So, as I just mentioned, I mean, in my now intense relationship that is ongoing with Ovid and the translation of the Metamorphoses, a text Calvino loved and understood with extraordinary intelligence. I think there would be a lot to say about Calvino as a metamorphic author, all the metamorphic activity that is happening in his work. I read the other day, I did speak about Calvino at also at the Casa Italiana at NYU, and I read a section from one of the cities. Yes, and there's a moment, maybe I'll just read it in Italian and I can kind of explain what's happening. I don't have the English with me, but this is from Le Città Nascoste 3, the third hidden city, the hidden cities. And he writes in Italian, in quel momento tutti gli spazi cambiano. In that moment, all the spaces change. This is a language of Ovid. Le altezze, le distanze, la città si trasfigura. The heights, the distances, the city takes another shape. Diventa cristallina, it becomes crystalline, trasparente come una libellula, transparent as a dragonfly. This is a moment of metamorphosis, literally embedded in this section of Invisible Cities. So I think he's very preoccupied with metamorphosis in the fact that metamorphosis is always pointing to hybridity. Metamorphosis is always pointing to one form, breaking out of its form and reforming, in the sense that metamorphosis is pointing to the interruption and the instability of all things. I think in Quickness, yes, in Quickness, in the second of the essays, the memos for the next millennium, he talks toward the end of that essay about a centaur-like figure created by Mercury and Vulcan. He says, Mercury and Vulcan represent two inseparable and complementary functions of life. And then he says, I'll skip a little bit, he says, when I read the explanation of Mercury and Vulcan as both contrasting and complementary, I began to grasp something I had previously only vaguely intuited, something about myself, about how I am and how I wish to be. So there's identification, there's personal identification with this idea. Vulcan's concentration and craftsmanship are necessary in order to write about Mercury's adventures and transformations. So we have the two figures, we have the two attitudes of Mercury and Vulcan. Mercury on one hand, Vulcan on the other. Vulcan is, of course, the forger, right? And there's this word, transformations, in that passage that I cited. I think one of the broader things that link Ovid and Calvino and make them both postmodern writers is their rejection of the idea of authenticity and of origins, or their insistence on reinventing, redefining what we think of, what we'd like to think of as points of origin, and therefore concepts of authenticity and all sorts of a whole series of words like native and original. I mean, Calvino, I think on a textual level, in his ongoing preoccupation with the problematics of translation and the phenomenon of translation, and also on a thematic level, is pointing to or troubling the idea, conventional ideas of text and translation. Again, back to translation in the sense of there's a text we think of, there's a text that is a point of origin that can then generate translations. So Calvino, in his forging, because he's a great forger, is reworking so many previous forms, epic forms, tales. He's a short story writer. He is the master of sort of interruptions, which is something very Ovidian. And he takes these, he takes ideas and he sort of strips them and turns them, gives them a kind of a mythic framework, but mythic in the sense of, I mean, I think one of the most powerful things about myth for me is the fact that myths don't belong to anybody. There is no point of origin. There's a palimpsest quality to the creation of mythology that we know, that we understand. And this is a very radical idea when we think about sort of literature and the history of literature and what we think of, we can trace back the roots and the point of origin. I think Calvino, like Ovid in his moment, is trying to push back against that notion that there's that direct line, which is why I would agree with Alessandro's reading of a spiraling and of bent paths. And what else can I say on this topic? I think that's where I would end and open up to another round of questions. On the topic, to refresh our memory, of this idea of, shall we say, the connection between Calvino and an alternative epic tradition or mythology, anything to do with those ideas. Origins, authenticity. I mean, I think what I say in that essay, what I said repeated today, that Calvino is not really, a purely Italian writer, sort of speaks to that issue. Okay, I mean, I don't know, some of you perhaps were at the Casa Italiana the other day when there was a lovely documentary about Calvino and his work and his life. 85% of the time he's speaking in French. Okay, he lives in France, he lives in Paris, he marries an Argentine translator. Giovanna Calvino, his daughter, was at this event and she shared the letters between her mother and father when they were first courting, falling in love. And he wrote letters to her in Italian, she wrote letters to him in Spanish. So, I mean, today I have a kind of a communication challenge with the absent Alessandro, but he literally, I mean, they had an ongoing challenge of communication in their marriage. So, any observations or questions? Yes?
Hi. I don't know much about Calvino, but when you were speaking of like rejecting points of origin, I was reminded how Ovid himself was like exiled from Rome, and how I think like he may have like finished the Metamorphoses while in exile. Could you potentially like speak or expand about like exile, whether it's like self-imposed or forced upon you, and how that relates to metamorphosis and translation?
Wow, that's a complex question. I mean, I think I'm glad you brought up the idea of or the fact of exile. Ovid was exiled by Augustus and was his exile was productive in that he wrote one of his most extraordinary poems when he was kept away from Rome and from Latin, from his language, from his place of origin. And he felt these things very keenly, and at the same time, I think in his work he was, constantly sort of undoing the myth of origin, and we see that again and again. Certainly in the Metamorphoses, when the entire concept of origins is broken down as a form, as an idea. Calvino is in a different kind of exile, a voluntary exile. He picks up, he leaves Italy at a certain point. He moves to Paris mostly to be close to Chiquita, his wife, or to-be wife, and raises his Giovanna's, I think she's born there, but she's raised there. She goes to school there. And he likes it. He likes the distance. He wants the distance. He craves the distance from Italian, hearing Italian every day all around him. And I imagine the physical distance as well. And so there are different kinds of exile. And of course, Calvino always had the possibility of returning to Italy, but I don't think he, I mean, I think one of the reasons he speaks to me personally is that he's not, he himself has no fixed point of origin. He was always inventing and reinventing himself as he was inventing and reinventing form, literary form, and refusing to sort of descend from a straight line. And in fact, the next question, I think one of these questions is about the idea of descendancy and what that meant for him. Any other remarks? Yeah.
So following up on your comment that Calvino's Italian was more of a sort of universal language, or came from a language that existed in his mind as a more universal language, are his attempts at this sort of mythopoesis, or transforming myth, an attempt to reach some more universal myth, something more essential to all humanity or human beings from all times and places? Or is it just a form of play, and does he end up there accidentally? Or is it a real focused project of his to reach that by transforming myth?
I thank you for your question. I'm very glad you put the word play in play, because Calvino loved to giocare, to play with everything, with language, with form, but mostly with register. He was constantly in the dialogue between high and low. For him was very important. So this is why we have an author who is equally attuned to folkloric tradition and mythology, and to sort of high Renaissance epic, to Latin epic, to other works made in other centuries, very kind of formally crafted, articulated, better to say, forms. And this was I think his way of intertwining and combining. I mean, his work, his game. I would say in Italian, I would call it a gioco combinatorio. A game in which he is constantly trying to fit two different parts together, and again insist upon that mixture, which is a form of dissent, if you will. I mean, if we go to another author, Italian author, more or less, of the same century Calvino is active in, Primo Levi, who talks about the importance of dissent, that grain of mustard seed, he says in the periodic table, the essential role of that grain of dissent to combat fascism, because we know that fascism is born from the idea of the one, the myth of the origin of this pure line of descent. And this is what Primo Levi is, clearly contrasting in his writing. But I think Calvino, in his own way, Calvino was I mean, he was, had strong political affiliations to the Communist Party. Then things shift, and he has he parts ways, but he has very strong ideas about these topics, about what it means to have lived under fascism and to resist fascism. So, but I think it's intentional. To answer your question, I think it is a very intentional game that he is playing, a game to undermine all sorts of traditional conceptions and conventions.
Thank you. I think like going off of that theme of play and dissent, it's interesting when you brought up this idea of troubling, of interrupting in addition to translation, or in conversation with the act of translation, as translation, as we speak of authenticity, often implies this idea of a point of reference or precision, whereas troubling, there's almost a lack of care, but also in the vein of Calvino, there's definitely this kind of patience and deep understanding. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that tension between troubling and translation, especially as it relates to myth as framework or order, and the idea of imposing chaos within that.
I'm just trying to parse a little bit the different parts. So the question is about order in translation and the role of chaos in translation, potentially, or? That is a very interesting question. I mean, of course, precision has a lot to do with translation, because translation it's kind of a hybrid practice, shall we say. And if we're talking about literary translation, it's a hybrid practice in that we are, one must be the writer, at times the poet, or whatever the case may be, whatever the project at hand is, and also maintain a sort of rigorous distance and handling of language, and aim for accuracy, not to be confused with a literal correspondence, which is not really viable when we're talking about literary translation. And so I do think that, again, you know, Calvino, who is in so many ways always on a very fine edge in terms of, you know, that idea of the edge between the state of two states of being. I think he would say in translation that that both of these forces must come together in translation, because if we hew too much to the idea of being accurate and working only with the language, we're going to sort of, you know, the danger is painting oneself into a corner of accuracy. And that's why I do think, I mean, Calvino loved to play with he even played with his identity. So he would say, I'm this, but he was really that. I mean, he has lots of tricks up his sleeve all the time. And I think that a translator must have a lot of tricks up their sleeves as well to get away with what translation is, because it's really a kind of a getting away with it type of activity. It's not rational. It's not really explainable. There's no instruction book for how to do it. Every project is unique. Every translation is unique, and the goal is to get away with it and to have a lot of tricks up your sleeve and to play with it and to play with the text, rigorously play with the text. Okay, I'm going to go on to the third question, if that's okay. And then we can have more, if there's time, we can just have more conversation. But I do want to get to all of Alessandro's questions. 3, okay. Does it even make sense to think in genealogical terms, parentheses, traditions, sources, models, etc.? Actually, these questions are all kind of interconnected, so we can build from one to the other. Okay, so does it make sense to think in genealogical terms for an author who challenged the paradigm of influence as much as Calvino did. He directly rewrote his favorite classics. He assigned to himself and to us 3 ancestors, I nostri antenati, who defy and meet traditional expectations at the same time. He is among the most experimental and the most neoclassical authors of his generation. Does his centaur-like bothness, his chimeric hybridity, back to the language of centaurs and hybridity, make it harder to imagine him as the literary son or father of anyone? Does it mess with time too, besides space, language, culture, nations, making Calvino a contemporary rather than a descendant or ancestor of us and of Renaissance poets? This is kind of, I mean, there's kind of an indistinct border between this and the previous question, previous questions, because we are talking about influence, we are talking about remaking, we are talking about the connective tissue, shall we say, across centuries, and what authors do in terms of their production and how they produce and react to the past. I would say that, I mean, Calvino is a bit of a, he's like a scoglio, you know, he's like this rock in the middle of the ocean. He's on his own. There is a very solitary quality to him when you think about it. This is my opinion. He is taken under the wing of Pavese, Cesare Pavese at Einaudi, who kind of grooms him and welcomes him and takes him under his wing. This is true. But in his life work, I mean, Calvino was such an, I mean, inexhaustible, the number of introductions, the books. I mean, he worked because, well, this is, maybe I should have said this from the beginning of what else constitutes his hybrid identity. He has a professionally hybrid identity, right? Because he's a writer, he's a translator, and he's a publisher. He's working at Einaudi. He's working at, you know, the most important, prestigious publishing company in Italy in a moment of Einaudi's history, which is extraordinary. Things are just exploding, and he is there, and he is writing he's putting out books, he's promoting authors, he's writing sort of in the day-to-day moment, but not only contemporary authors. So if you read, I have this amazing book of just his flap copy material. It's a beautiful book. The examples are all over the place, and I think he leans toward either the dead, so dead authors from previous centuries, or the distant, so obscure authors whom you know, that in other languages, whom he is going out of his way to bring to Italian readership, and that is my sense of the way he plays the father as a literary father, shall we say. He is a father to those who have come before him, perhaps who have fallen out of favor, who have gotten lost along the way, and tries to rear them up and give them exposure, give them space and recognition on the page. And, you know, I mean, he's obsessed, rightly so, with writers like Borges and so on. In a moment where, you know, in which, you know, not everybody is aware of, you know, who is Borges, what is he doing? So he is on the front line, I think, as a father. But from where does Calvino spring? This is a very interesting question, because he is, I think we can safely say he's sui generis. And the meaning of that is that he is, you know, he is one of a kind. He is one of a kind, and I don't think we can trace a direct line. I mean, Alessandro would speak to this so much more intelligently than I am able to in terms of Italian literary history. And we can say, oh, yes, Ariosto, oh, yes, Leopardi, oh yes, Montale, I mean, yes, we see the influences, we see the traces, we see the presence, but there's some alchemical process by which he is metabolizing and absorbing and creating highly unique works from the sources and the influences, as opposed to, sort of seeing a direct connection. Alessandro, in fact, referred to him once as a necromancer. Any thoughts on this? I see a hand at the back.
I hope this ties in, but you had mentioned translation, and I was curious, when you're working and translating, are you still writing as yourself, or are you almost more of an actor playing the part of the author you're translating? And how does it feel creatively when you're working in translation versus as when you're just creating a story?
Is this a question for me? Yes. Okay. Well, I don't want to dismiss your question. I feel like we should stay a little bit on track with Calvino. But I can share something that Calvino said on being translated, which I think is relevant. I'm not trying to step away from your question, but I really love what he says here about, okay, I'll just read this section. And it has a lot, but he has this amazing essay called "To Translate is the Real Way of Reading a Text," which is something you may have heard. In his essay, "To Translate is the Real Way of Reading a Text," Calvino speaks of the issues of multiplicity by referring to different levels of language. He argues that translation, quote, requires a sort of miracle, I would agree, speaking of its secret essence, that's a quote, as if it were an extract to distill with the proper equipment. He is attuned to issues of translation not only as a translator-writer, but as a man of letters who was also a scientist. This essential double nature underlies the way that he reflects on the problematic nature of translation. He writes, quote, "True literature works along the untranslatable margins of every language." Perhaps the most startling observation in his essay is this, that due to the discrepancy between the spoken and written language, Italian writers, quote, always have a problem with their own language, and they live in a state of linguistic neurosis, unquote. Calvino is able to identify this problem because he looks at Italian from both inside and outside, as if it were a foreign tongue, or in any case, like his character Mr. Palomar, from a measured distance. Calvino appreciated being translated, not only to be read in more places, but also in order to, quote, understand better what I have written and why. This is so powerful. So in essence, he relies on being translated to understand what he's written in the quote-unquote original version of his text. And I, as a writer, find this to be very much the case, that it's in translation that I can really understand what I have written. And now that and I don't want to spend too much time on my own situation, but now that I have some experience translating myself, I see this to be very much the case, that it's only when I step outside of the work and translate it that I understand the book that I've written. So I just conclude here, translation for him was a form of gneuthisauton, a revelatory process to see and know himself from a new angle, from a foreign and alienating perspective. And I think that's really one of my key, one of the things I've really come to understand and appreciate about Calvino is the centrality of the alien, the centrality of that alien, foreign, if you will, perspective to understand the self. Should I take, how are we doing with time, Abigail? Are we okay? So? Yeah? Should I take one more question and then move on? Okay, so one more question on this topic, and then we have the last question and then the special bonus question. I know you're all so excited. Okay, so one more question.
Yeah, wasn't Calvino also very much influenced by the Oulipians in France and all the mix of science, mathematics, and literature, and playing games with that?
He was. He was interested in all sorts of movements and tendencies and currents, but never fully. I think there was always a moment when he pulled back and sort of maintained a peripheral position to these movements. I mean, he kind of throws himself into a lot of new ideas, new innovative ways of writing, of thinking about language in particular. And I think translators as just the species of translators are always looking for innovation in new ways, right? New ways to render a text, new ways to render an old text, how to make it relevant, how to keep something relevant, how to renew language. This is no small task. So he was, but I would say that he sort of, wove in and out of different modes of thinking, and never identified fully with anything, I think, other than his own very particular vision and poetics. Okay, thank you for your question. So this is number 4. When we spoke on the phone about this event, you told me how much you were fond of Calvino's descriptions. A certain tradition of Italian scholarship tends to turn down the temperature of Calvino's writing to an absolute zero of rational, albeit amused, ironic detachment, a purely cerebral and aerial creative gaze. However, the main quality of Calvino's observational style and point of view is arguably the opposite. The transparency of his descriptive prose feels like the result of a full participation. Unlike those of coeval experimentalists in the Gruppo 63 or the Nouveau Roman or the École de Regard, Calvino's eye doesn't aspire to become a photographic lens. It is always thoroughly human, even when he writes sci-fi. Would you agree? I would agree very much. So among the things I teach courses in creative writing. So what does that mean? I teach students how to work imaginatively with language to create stories, scenes, sometimes just building a scene. And I always use Calvino as a model to understand the art of describing something concrete or something incredibly abstract. And he is a master of this of this very phenomenon, I would call it, of how to use language, which is in and of itself an abstract system, to recreate, to suggest, so specifically life. And he's very preoccupied with vision, with sight. In English, we have the very convenient play on words with the I and the I, the io, the me, I, which is not the same in Italian, but lends itself very nicely to the English reading of Calvino, and I think that he here too he is able to combine in his ongoing combinatory, is that a word in English, game playing, the precise with the poetic. And he knows that language is the eye. Language is the source of vision. This is what I think he is able to get at and investigate and interrogate in his work. And I'm going to read you a passage of Calvino's descriptive power, okay? This is from early work. This is from a story from, or actually, I don't know how, when did he publish Difficult Loves? I think these stories are a little bit later, like Chiara, lo sai tu? No. Anyway, I'm turning to my expert Calvino team here in the audience. But this is, I'm just going to read a passage from one of the last stories, which is The Adventure of a Poet. This is a very brief passage. He's describing a grotto. They entered a grotto. It began spaciously, like an interior lake of pale green, under a broad vault of rock. Farther on, it narrowed to a dark passage. The man with the paddle turned the dinghy around to enjoy the various effects of the light from outside through the jagged aperture, dazzled with colors, made more vivid by the contrast. The water there sparkled, and the shafts of light ricocheted upward in conflict with the soft shadows that spread from the rear. Reflections and flashes communicated to the rock walls and the vault the instability of the water. So if anyone's ever been in a little boat and gone into a grotto for, a minute or whatever, I mean, it's all very lovely and it's happening, and all of this natural phenomenon is going on. But I find that this language, this descriptive prowess of Calvino, I find one of his perhaps acknowledged or unacknowledged, I can't say, but I find the we can see the line of descent from, say, Lucretius, who was a poet, Latin poet, extraordinary poet, who is, has that scientific language to study and to understand and to recreate and to represent all sorts of scientific phenomenon. Now, natural phenomenon, of course, written in his time period with the knowledge that one had of things like what makes thunder, what makes rain, why does it snow, why do people die, etc., what happens to the body. But this is that kind of attention to the world that we see in Calvino's mode of description. He also, I can share from Exactitude, he cites himself examples of poets who write about very specific elements of the natural world. I'll just read a little bit from this. Is from Exactitude. In this line of inquiry, I should back up by saying if you want to really do a deep dive into Calvino's powers of description, I would recommend the book Palomar, or Mr. Palomar in English, which is sort of a series of descriptions of all kinds of things, from a wave to cheese, that will blow your mind. I mean, it's just an extraordinary work. So he says, in this line of inquiry, I have kept in mind the experience of poets. I think of William Carlos Williams, who describes cyclamen leaves in such minute detail that he causes the flower to take shape and bloom from the trees he has described, and so succeeds in giving the poem the lightness of the plant. I think of Marianne Moore, who in depicting her pangolin and her nautilus and all the other creatures of her bestiary imbues information from zoology books with symbolic and allegorical significance, making each of her poems a moral fable. So he's looking to poets and their relationship with the natural world, with the physical world, and again, creating a unique language that is at once the language of poetry and the language of sort of this precision and fact. And that is why I agree with Alessandro that Calvino is not, describing life from a vantage point of total detachment. Or, I mean, not that anybody can, not even the writers that he's citing, in my opinion. There's always some sort of filter. Are there any questions on description and Calvino? I see some hands at the back.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I first read Calvino when I was a teenager, which was a few decades ago now, and there was a passage in Invisible Cities related to what you were talking about now, where he writes, memory's images, once they are fixed in words, are erased. And I was struck at the time and since with the sort of beauty of that sentiment, and I've gone back and forth on how true I think it is. And I was curious, your thoughts, your experience as a writer, have you found that to be true or not?
Very much so, and I think, I was just talking this morning with my students in a course I'm teaching on diary writing, and in this particular work we were looking at sort of the problematics of containing memory in language and the inevitable disconnect of even that gesture of trying to remember something in words, and the instant sort of attrition involved. So I think that is something I would agree with, absolutely. Any other comments on description?
I was thinking in reference to an earlier point that you made about the marginalia in the Castle of Cross Destinies, and the idea that he would be using completely different forms of art to create more information. And I was wondering, I know he also worked in other forms besides prose, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about any of the other stuff that he did. I think he did libretti, and he may have done some film. I'm not sure about that.
I don't know of any film that he was involved with music. He was involved with musicians, I know that, songwriting, but I don't know of his involvement with cinema. There are documentaries made of him. Perhaps, I don't know if everybody doesn't know, but his parents are botanists, so he has this sort of very literally sort of rooted to the ground fascination with everything that comes out of the ground and how it grows, and at the same time a kind of ethereal, quality. And it's not surprising that he's interested in the tarot and sort of this type of symbolism and working with elements and sort of, I don't know, that other language, shall we say, of understanding or interpreting ourselves, our lives, our souls. But I don't know about any cinematic contribution. Chiara?
Yeah, it's less of a question and more of a thought. I think as you were talking about the description and the way Calvino uses language and description, you touched on and Alessandro also touched on the big misunderstanding on the fact that Calvino is this like super rational being, and I think it's really like you only need to read one description to understand that he is describing the chaos of the word and like
Absolutely.
speaking from a place of chaos, like he says in that essay on the novel that guardiamo il mondo cadendo dalla tromba delle scale, like we're looking while falling down, and there is this quality of really anxiety and like all those elements piling up in his descriptions that also I think well, we talked before about the connection with the classical tradition, the metamorphosis, the unpredictability, right, of bringing together things that clash with each other.
Thank you. Thank you for that observation. And it does tie into some other things we've been talking about, the chaotic force that is part of the dialogue of Calvino's broader dialogue. And I think there's extreme anxiety, the energy of anxiety in all of Calvino's work. And I think that that rational impulse or that draw toward the rational is, of course, a way, I mean, what is it if not a way to control forces of chaos and disorder, which are there, you know? And I think the way he tries to redefine and maintain control is sort of the unexpected sort of role reversal of sort of reading, creating, you know, like the act of reading and engaging with text as somehow being the center of life and everything else being peripheral. This is kind of a radical way he has, I think, of imposing order. There's a nice passage, actually, that's coming to mind in The Adventure of a Traveler. I thought about this story today when Alessandro said, I'm not going to make it. And I picked up this story again. And this passage is very rich, very suggestive, very evocative, because so the character is going to Rome to see his lover. And he gets into a train compartment, and he says he needs to create a psychological effect. I think maybe I'll read this to you, and then I have just the fun question. Federico V chose an empty compartment, not over the wheels, but not too far into the coach either, because he knew that as a rule, people who board a train in haste tend to reject the first few compartments. The defense of the space necessary to stretch out and travel lying down is made up of tiny psychological devices. Federico knew them and employed them all. For example, he drew the curtains over the door, an act that performed at this point might even seem excessive, but it aimed, in fact, at a psychological effect. Seeing those drawn curtains, the traveler who arrives later is almost always overcome by an instinctive scruple and prefers, if he can find it, a compartment with perhaps 2 or 3 people in it already, but with the curtains open. Federico strewed his bag, overcoat, newspapers on the seats opposite and beside him. Another elementary move, abused and apparently futile, but actually of use. Not that he wanted to make people believe those places were occupied. Such a subterfuge would have been contrary to his civic conscience and to his sincere nature. He wanted only to create a rapid impression of a cluttered, not very inviting compartment, a simple, rapid impression. He sat down and heaved a sigh of relief. He had learned that being in a setting where everything can only be in its place, the same always, anonymous, without possible surprises, like today, filled him with calm, with self-awareness, freedom of thought. His whole life rushed along in disorder, but now he found the perfect balance between interior stimulus and the impassive neutrality of material things. This is a very rich passage to think about this tension between the order and the disorder and the subterfuge, the game playing. I mean, I think this passage, we can read it as a kind of Calvino's poetics is represented in how he's moving into this compartment. He's choosing very carefully. He knows how to do it. It's very strategic. And I wanted to just mention, so Calvino talks in exactitude, I believe, no, in quickness. in quickness, he talks about how for many years he really identified with this Latin motto, festina lente, which is kind of an oxymoron of quickly, make haste slowly. And he really identified with this idea. And we see it here when he repeats this idea of creating a rapid impression, a simple, rapid impression. But he's going about it in a very methodical way. And that is also a way that Calvino is straddling, you know, just in terms of his, the simultaneous gesture of the rapidity and the methodical and the deliberate and the strategic, and I would say the game-playing energy that is behind all of this work. So I don't know how we're doing, but I am going to read this final question from Alessandro. He says, oops, here we go. For our conversation, we had planned, this is true, to draw a few cards from my tarot deck. Our inspiration was Il Castello dei Destini Incrociati, in which the cross destinies of the characters are determined by the cards printed in the margins of the book, as we've discussed. As I land in Seattle, too late to get the connection, the alternative connection to New York that I had booked after my second flight was canceled, I decided to draw 3 cards from that deck. I hope you'll still want to say what they make you think of about Calvino. I am only using the major arcana. And the first I got is the Tower. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the tarot, so the tarot is a card that represents a few things, but one is chaos, this force that we've been talking about all night. The other is radical change, so something that's unexpected. So in a way, the Tower is, well, it's a comment on today, and the unexpected, and the force of the unexpected. I think we can think of it in a couple of ways in terms of Calvino. I think of Calvino himself as a force of radical change in his contribution as a truly groundbreaking, sui generis literary figure who changes the game. He changes the literary game forever. And we cannot dispute this contribution. I think when I think of the Tower, just more literally, sort of as an element of a city. So we know that, you know, Calvino's fascinated with the city, with cities, because they are sort of a crossroads between sort of the geometrical planning, the idea of a planned city, which so many cities were, well, all cities are, but you know, historically, strategically planned cities, right, for as defenses and so forth. So that idea of planning intentional geometry and what he calls, to repeat, the tangle of human life. But I think of the Barone Rampante, right, the kid, right, the brother who just climbs a tree and is a kind of tower and insists on looking at everything from another perspective. And this we can think of very much as a Calvino stand-in, because he is someone who refuses to sit at the table, right? Refuses to sit at the dinner table of literature, of life. He is, you know, he makes a radical gesture to look at things from a different perspective, and he always did that. But it also implies an isolation. I would also say the Tower card, is the card of the 3 cards that is mostly connected to the tragic loss of Calvino, which was shocking and sudden, totally unexpected. And I think it's appropriate to acknowledge just how traumatic his loss was to those who knew him, not only personally, but as to his readers. The second card Alessandro drew on the airplane is the world. So now the world is a card that represents completion and the sort of union of universal elements and forces. It's a woman who's balanced on one foot. So she sort of has a cross, right? So she's balanced on one foot. I was struck by this choice or this card that Alessandro drew because again, in Exactitude, Alessandro Calvino says, he mentions that he's a Libra. So all about balance. And I mean, I think beyond the sort of obvious ideas of his internationalism, his refusal to sort of have any real kind of motherland, fatherland, what have you, the sort of shifting planes of identity, cultural, linguistic identity, even though he did write always in technically Italian, but as I've argued, an Italian that is layered with and complicated and enriched by other languages, both literally other languages and other linguaggi, which we don't have a word in English for this word. But I think that what is interesting about this card of the world that represents completion is that, to go back to his death, his life, he left so much. I mean, it ended so abruptly. And we can only imagine all that he would have done to complete the creative journey that he was not destined to make. But at the same time, I think there's something, he's very attuned to the idea of things unfinished, things infinite, and in fact, in quickness, no, I think this is an exactitude, sorry. He talks about, he cites Leopardi, and he talks about that idea of the indistinct and the infinite, and things that cannot be contained, things that cannot be held together, the geometry that will no longer hold, because of those elements of chaos and inability to define, to set borders around experience, around language. And then the final card, Alessandro says, is death. So, well, I've talked already about the death of Calvino. I don't think this card makes me think of the death of Calvino at all, because, of course, the death card is the most misunderstood card in the tarot. And people are very afraid of it because of, the obvious reasons. When I looked at the death card again today, thinking about this conversation, I thought of the Cavaliere Inesistente, because death is riding horse and death is a skeleton. And so this idea of the rider, the knight who is not existent, to me has an interesting correspondence with this card. The death card represents all sorts of transitions, states of transition. So we've talked about that. We've talked about metamorphosis, change, the power of change. So I think of that. I think of Calvino as being a very misunderstood writer. And I think I would perhaps close with that idea. I think even today, he is among our most misunderstood writers. And I think it's very easy to sort of try to say, oh, he was very cold scientific writer, or oh, he was an experimental writer, or oh, he was, but the thing is that Calvino, in his infinite game-playing wisdom is as we are saying, as we are trying to ascribe and describe what he was and what he did, he is already on to the next thing and kind of slipping out of our grasp. And I think even that now that he is no longer alive, and to speak for these things for himself, and of course he spoke with such erudition and intelligence about his, not only about his the work of others, but about his own work. He keeps us guessing as we read him, and I feel that he's a writer that I will certainly be happily trying to decipher for the rest of my life. So that's the end of our questions. Thank you so much for coming.